Whether through the unparalleled savageness of a frontier street fight or the quiet betrayal of a family tea service, crime remains a constant thread in human history. At Enter the Crime, we believe that understanding these dark corners is the only way to see the light. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more global true crime told like a documentary. I'm your narrator, Ava, and with Braden here tonight, and this is Enter the Crime.
Smoothing the blankets and just gently insisting that the sick woman drink every last drop of this warm, comforting liquid.
But it wasn't comforting at all, was it?
No, not even a little. In reality, that cup of tea was a weapon. And it was so perfectly disguised and so devastatingly calibrated that the entire medical establishment of the era spent literally years being completely blind to it.
Yeah, it was the perfect subversion of the social contract. And what makes that specific moment so chilling isn't just the act of murder itself. It's the camouflage.
The plot, exactly.
It's the way humanity has learned to dress up malice in the most polite, civilized rituals imaginable.
Well, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Pull up a chair, because you are joining us at the table as a fellow investigator today. We've got a fascinating stack of sources that chart a very dark, very revealing evolution.
It really is a journey.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to explore the jarring contrast between raw, unfiltered historical death and the intricate ways we humans try to sanitize, aestheticize, or even philosophize our way out of facing mortality.
And we're covering a lot of ground to do
We
that.
really are. We are moving from the bloody, chaotic frontier of 19th century America to the polite, tea-drinking drawing rooms of the 1950s, and finally...
We're going to space.
Yeah, finally into the philosophical cosmos of modern lore.
Because, we look at a figure like that smiling grandmother, Auntie Carrie, and we instinctively label her a monster. We call her an anomaly.
Right.
But if you strip away the teacup, her underlying philosophy, which is basically the ruthless taking of life for personal empowerment, isn't an anomaly at all.
No, it's really not.
In fact, if we look at our historical records, that brutal reality is the baseline of human existence. And modern storytellers are currently framing that exact same pathology as a cosmic law.
So to understand why we invented the civilized fictional murder, the cozy mystery where everything is wrapped up with a neat little bow.
Which we all love.
Which we love. But we first have to look at what historical death actually looked like before we had the luxury of sanitizing it. We need to look at the frontier.
Right.
Sitting in front of us is a massive, incredibly raw archive. It's the Luganbuehl Funeral Home Records.
Yes.
And this is a ledger covering Washington County, Benton County, and parts of the Indian Territory from 1839 to 1912. And honestly, reading through these pages is a profoundly visceral experience.
It completely strips away all the Hollywood romanticism we attach to the 19th century American expansion.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't see the heroic cowboy or the noble pioneer. You see a daily ledger of sheer chaotic mortality. Death in this environment wasn't something hidden away in sterile hospital wards or managed by grief counselors.
Not at all.
It was public, it was messy, and it was relentlessly every day.
And the sheer absurdity of how people died, it almost defies belief. Let's look at the mechanics of this chaos, because it's really important to understand the environment these people were navigating.
Okay.
Take the case of Ben Smith in 1887. The record states that some parties were using giant powder, which is a colloquial term for dynamite, in a 14-foot pool of water in the Illinois River to kill fish.
Right, which even in 1887 was a known, albeit highly illegal, practice.
Who would hope so?
Yeah, giant powder was essentially nitroglycerin absorbed into a porous material like sawdust or diatomaceous earth. It was incredibly unstable.
Like volatile.
Very. But it delivered a massive concussive shockwave. In a liquid medium like a river pool, that overpressure wave travels significantly faster and with way more devastating force than in the air.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it instantly ruptures the swim bladders of any fish in the vicinity.
So the powder explodes, the water erupts, and a massive fish floats to the surface. It's stunned but still twitching, showing signs of life. Ben Smith, acting on pure instinct, just jumps into the pool with his arms extended to grab the catch.
He just jumps right in.
Just jumps right in. But the moment he strikes the water, he utters a single shriek and sinks like lead.
Wow.
Yeah. And when they drag him out a few minutes later, his limbs are already stiff and rigid, and the coroner's report claims he was instantly killed by the shock of electricity caused by the giant powder.
The phrasing there is such a perfect window into the scientific ignorance of the era.
Right, because dynamite doesn't make electricity.
Exactly. Dynamite doesn't leave residual electricity in the water.
Yeah.
What the 19th century coroner misidentified as electricity was almost certainly the traumatic, concussive aftermath of the blast wave.
Like the pressure.
Right. Or
Right.
perhaps Smith suffered an immediate massive cardiac arrest, triggered by the sudden thermal shock of the cold water combined with the adrenaline of the moment.
That makes sense.
The rigidity they observed wasn't electrical rigor. It was the instant physiological shutdown of a human body subjected to extreme environmental trauma.
Right. So the science was flawed, but the result was exactly the same. A split-second, entirely mundane decision to grab a fish resulted in instant death.
It was gone.
There were no safety protocols, no warning labels, just a man, a river, and a stick of explosives.
It's wild.
And it gets even more tragically absurd. Listen to the mechanics of this 1869 incident involving a man named Reuben Ford.
Okay, what happened here?
So he lives near Elm Springs, and he takes his young grandson out turkey hunting.
Oh, no.
Yeah. They get separated in the dense brush. The boy, just playing around, crouches down in the undergrowth and mimics the whistle of a wild turkey.
See, that is a child playing a game in a survival environment.
Exactly.
It really highlights the absolute lack of a buffer zone between domestic life and lethal force.
Yeah.
Firearms were ubiquitous. They were necessary tools for sustenance and defense. But that ubiquity meant the margin for human error was practically zero.
So Reuben Ford hears the whistle. He peers through the brush, sees the foliage moving, raises his rifle, and fires.
Oh, Mike.
He runs over to claim his bird and finds he has shot his own grandson squarely in the face.
That is horrific.
The bullet entered just below the left eye. The boy dies shortly after, and the local paper dryly notes, "It is feared that Mr. F will never recover from the effects of the shock."
I can't even imagine.
It reads like the script of a horror movie where the universe is just actively trying to eliminate you, like Final Destination or something.
Because the universe, or at least the natural environment of the Arkansas frontier, was actively hostile.
Yes.
The home was not a sanctuary. The boundary between the wild and the domestic simply didn't exist.
Right. Like you read about Mrs. Scudder in Brentwood in 1896. She leaves her sleeping infant alone in the cabin for just a few minutes to go out to the yard to find her older daughter.
Okay.
While she's gone, a wild hog wanders through the open door and almost completely devours the sleeping baby.
A wild hog.
Just wanders in. Or the 1909 case of the Calderhead family. They are sitting in their living room during a rainstorm. Lightning strikes the chimney, travels down the masonry, instantly kills the mother as she steps away from the mantle,
Oh, wow.
leaps across the room to render the father unconscious, kills the 18-year-old daughter sitting next to him, and then grounds itself in a box of bedclothes.
The physics of that lightning strike perfectly encapsulate the era, honestly.
How so?
Well, a chimney is often the highest point of a structure, and the carbon soot lining the inside is highly conductive.
Oh, right.
So the lightning took the path of least resistance right into the heart of the home. When you are surrounded by this level of random, omnidirectional lethality, a wild animal, a stray bullet, an atmospheric discharge, it fundamentally shapes your psychological worldview.
Absolutely.
Life is inherently fragile, and chaos is the reigning monarch.
Which brings up a really crucial point about how these people processed grief and mortality. With death being this random and this blunt, did anyone living in 1890s Arkansas have the luxury of viewing death as a mystery?
No, not at all.
I mean, when someone died, I can't imagine they were sitting around a parlor trying to deduce the exact timeline of events like a game of Clue.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the concept of the whodunit requires a society stable enough to view murder as an aberration rather than a routine occurrence.
Right, an exception to the rule.
Exactly. On the frontier, the who and the how were usually glaringly obvious. Even in cases of intentional homicide, the violence was public and incredibly blunt. Axes, shotguns, saloon brawls.
The Dan Title case from 1880s is the perfect example of that.
Oh, a Christmas Day one.
Yes. Captain Dan Title is standing in William K. Wood's saloon in Maysville on Christmas Day.
Yeah.
He gets into a verbal altercation with a young man named Ward.
Okay.
Title grabs Ward by the throat, shoves him against the wall, and punches him in the face. Ward simply reaches into his pocket, pulls out a knife, and stabs Title directly in the left breast.
Just like that.
Title falls dead on the floor, and the coroner's jury actually convenes right there in the saloon?
They don't even move the body.
No. They look at the body. listen to the bartender, and rule it justifiable homicide on the spot.
Wow. See, there is no detective analyzing the angle of the blade or the blood spatter patterns. The violence is immediate, the cause is undisputed, and the aftermath is purely an administrative cleanup.
Yeah, it's just paperwork.
Because there is no mystery, there's no opportunity for narrative control. The community cannot aestheticize what just happened. They simply clean the floor, bury the body, and try to survive the winter.
But humanity doesn't like chaos, do we? We don't like the idea that a wild hog or a drunk guy with a pocket knife can just end our existence without any deeper meaning.
We really don't.
So as society modernized, as we paved the roads and built stronger walls and moved indoors, that blunt force trauma began to shift. Violence didn't disappear, obviously. Human malice is a constant.
Always.
But it changed its wardrobe. It moved from the muddy street into the dining room.
The physical environment became regulated. We built infrastructure to keep the wild hogs out and implemented medical care to treat the spider bites.
Oh, very good.
But the capacity for destruction merely adapted to the new, constrained environment. It became insidious. It became hidden.
And this transition is fascinating to track. In the Arkansas records, we see the tail end of that raw, loud violence moving indoors.
Like the axe murders.
Exactly. You have the horrific 1899 case where J.C. Butler took an axe to his own teenage daughter in her bed.
Brutal.
Or the 1896 Duckworth family murder-suicide, where a man butchered his wife and child with an axe before slashing his own throat with a razor. It's domestic, but it's still deafeningly loud and profoundly messy.
It is the brute force of the frontier trapped inside four walls.
Yes. But then we cross the ocean and move forward just a few decades, and we enter an entirely different psychological landscape. We enter the world of the British Library crime classics.
Ah, the golden age.
The golden age of detective fiction. Books like Anne Hawking's Death in a Teacup. Suddenly, murder isn't a bloody axe in a log cabin. It's a carefully measured dose of arsenic in a drawing room.
This represents a massive shift in cultural semiotics.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the British domestic ritual of tea service is one of the most potent symbols of stability, order, and civilization in the modern world.
Oh, sure.
It is a socially mandated interruption of the day, designed specifically for comfort and polite discourse. To introduce a lethal element into that specific, highly regulated ritual is a brilliant, deeply subversive literary device.
It really is. And to truly understand how sanitized that fictional murder is, we have to look at a story from the Arkansas records that bridges this gap in the most heartbreaking way imaginable.
The Springdale Boys.
Yes. In 1897, in Springdale, two young brothers somehow got their hands on a bottle of strychnine. Their family had purchased it a year prior to exterminate moles in the garden.
Right.
The boys took the strychnine, used a case knife to mix it into a teacup with water, and hid the cup under their bed.
It's so sad.
They put on their Sunday best clothes, wrote a note to their parents that just said, "Meet us in heaven," tacked it to the bedroom door, and drank from the teacup.
Just awful.
Their grandfather found them shortly after, writhing in the absolute, unimaginable agonies of strychnine poisoning. Both boys died before a doctor could even arrive.
That is the historical reality of poison in a teacup. Strychnine is a neurotoxin that acts as an antagonist of glycine and acetylcholine receptors.
What does that mean for the body?
It causes severe, violent muscular convulsions. The body arches rigidly, the victim remains entirely conscious, and they ultimately die of asphyxiation because the respiratory muscles paralyze in a state of continuous contraction.
Oh my God.
The grandfather rushing into the room, the failed attempts to administer antidotes, the sheer physical horror of it, that is a scene of utter, uncontrolled devastation.
And contrast that agonizing reality with the appeal of the cozy mystery novel. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
In the Golden Age books, there is this strict fair play rule.
Right, the reader has to be able to solve it.
Exactly. The reader gets all the chemical clues. The detective calmly analyzes the sediment in the bone china. The victim usually just gasps, clutches their pearls, and slumps over neatly in their armchair.
Very tidy.
I am convinced that this entire genre of fiction was a massive, collective, psychological coping mechanism.
I think you are exactly right. Consider the historical context of the 1920s and 30s.
Right, society had just crawled out of the trenches of the First World War.
Millions of people had just experienced industrial-scale, indiscriminate slaughter, artillery shells, mustard gas, machine gun fire.
It was horrifying.
Death on a global scale was just as random and uncontrollable as the runaway horse or the lightning strike on the frontier, but magnified by a million.
So by turning murder into a civilized, intellectual puzzle involving a teapot, society was desperately trying to regain a sense of control.
Yes.
If you can deduce the exact solubility of arsenic in a cup of Earl Grey, if you can arrest the culprit and restore the social order by Chapter 20, you are domesticating death.
You're putting a leash on it.
Exactly. You are taking the chaos of the universe, putting it in a confined space, and proving that human intellect can conquer it.
You are asserting that the universe has rules, and that those rules can be understood. And the authors of this era were incredibly strategic.
How so?
They didn't just use the teacup as a prop. They utilized the actual physical and chemical properties of the tea service as the mechanism of the murder.
Let's get into the chemistry of that, because the sources detail exactly why tea is the perfect delivery system for a toxin.
It comes down to thermodynamics and solubility.
Okay, break that down for me.
Standard tea preparation requires water temperatures ranging from 80 to 100 degrees Celsius. In the realm of toxicology, the effectiveness of an ingested poison is largely determined by its solubility.
Like how well it mixes in.
Exactly. How completely it can dissolve into a liquid, which dictates how rapidly it can be absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract into the bloodstream.
So hot water is essentially supercharging the poison's ability to dissolve.
Precisely. Heat increases the kinetic energy of the water molecules, causing them to move faster and collide more forcefully with the solid particles of the poison, pulling the solute molecules apart.
Okay, that makes sense.
Let's look at arsenic trioxide, the classic odorless, tasteless weapon of 19th and early 20th century killers.
The classic.
Right. At standard room temperature around 20 degrees Celsius, its solubility is roughly 20 grams per liter. But bring that water to a boil at 100 degrees Celsius, and its solubility triples to about 60 grams per liter.
That is a massive leap. It means a killer can stir a highly lethal dose into the liquid, and the thermal energy ensures it dissolves completely.
Leaving absolutely no gritty residue or sediment at the bottom of the fine-bone china.
Wow.
Anne Hawking and Agatha Christie exploited this physical reality brilliantly. The detective holds the cup to the light, looking for the physical evidence of the weapon, but the heat has rendered it invisible.
And what about modern poisons?
Well, if we look at a more modern poison like thallium sulfate, the jump is even more terrifying. Its solubility goes from 48 grams per liter at room temperature to a staggering 180 grams per liter in boiling water.
Okay, so the heat hides the powder, but what about the taste? I mean, if you drop a chemical compound into my drink, my evolutionary biology is designed to taste bitterness and spit it out.
Yes, it is.
Strychnine is notoriously bitter.
Right. Very bitter. And this is where the specific botanical profile of the tea leaf is crucial.
Ah, okay.
Tea is heavily dominated by complex organic compounds called polyphenols, specifically catechins and tannins.
Tannins, like in wine.
Exactly like wine. These compounds are naturally astringent. They would give strong tea its slightly bitter, dry mouthfeel.
So the tea itself provides a natural chemical camouflage.
It is a phenomenal masking agent. The tannins bind to the receptors on your tongue, completely overwhelming the subtle metallic or bitter notes of many toxins.
Oh, that's wild.
If a killer brews a particularly strong pot of Assam or English breakfast, and then encourages the victim to add milk and sugar, as was standard in British and Australian tea culture, the taste of the poison is entirely obscured.
So you wouldn't even know.
You really wouldn't. Furthermore, the chemical interaction between tannins and certain toxic alkaloids can result in a temporary stabilization of the compound, delaying its breakdown until it reaches the acidic environment of the stomach.
So the victim takes a sip, maybe notices it tastes a bit strong, but they just assume the tea steeped for an extra minute.
Right. They just think it's a strong cup.
And the social pressure of the ritual prevents them from spitting it out. Like you're at a tea party, you're not going to spit your tea back into the cup.
Never.
So in fiction, the poisoner looks like a sophisticated mastermind executing a flawless, civilized game of chemical warfare.
But fiction is a sanitized sanctuary.
It is.
We must now transition from the curated violence of Anne Hawking's novels to the brutal historical reality of how this exact chemical camouflage was deployed in the real world.
Yes. We have to talk about Caroline Grylls. Auntie Carrie.
Auntie Carrie.
Sydney, Australia, in the early 1950s. If you put Caroline Grylls in a police lineup next to the sophisticated villains of Golden Age fiction, you know, the brooding aristocrats, the disgruntled heirs, the brilliant doctors, she would look entirely out of place.
Completely.
She was born in 1888, By the time her killing spree was at its peak, she was a plump, smiling 60-something grandmother. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and floral dresses. Her neighbors adored her.
She sounds like everybody's grandmother.
Exactly. She was constantly visiting her extended family, and she never arrived empty-handed. She brought homemade cakes, pies, jars of preserved ginger, and she always, always insisted on making and serving the tea.
She weaponized the archetype of the maternal caregiver.
Yes, she did.
She used the culturally ingrained trust that we instinctively afford to an older woman offering nourishment. It is the ultimate blind spot. You do not expect the grandmother baking you a pie to be a serial killer.
And she didn't use some exotic, untraceable alkaloid procured from a black market botanist in the Amazon.
No, she did not.
She went to the local hardware store and bought commercially available rodenticide.
She utilized thallium sulfate, which was widely marketed in Australia at the time, under the brand name Thalrat.
Thalrat. The sources repeatedly referred to thallium as the poisoner's poison and a murderer with patience.
Yes.
Why is thallium so uniquely suited for this specific kind of domestic slow burn horror? Like, how does it actually destroy a human body?
The mechanism of thallium is truly insidious because it operates as a cellular Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse. Okay, explain that.
As we discussed, it is colorless, tasteless, and highly soluble in hot liquids. But its real terror lies in its molecular structure. The thallium ion has an ionic radius of about 1.50 angstroms.
Okay, getting into the tiny numbers.
Yes, but this is key. This makes it incredibly similar in size and electrical charge to the potassium ion, which has a radius of about 1.38 angstroms.
And potassium is absolutely vital. Our bodies are practically built on it.
It is essential for survival. Every single cell in your body is encased in a membrane. Embedded within that membrane are complex protein structures called sodium-potassium ATPase pumps.
Okay, I remember those from biology class.
You can think of them as microscopic, highly regulated revolving doors. Their entire job is to constantly pump sodium ions out of the cell and pull potassium ions into the cell.
To keep balance.
Exactly. This maintains the precise electrochemical gradient required for nerve impulses to fire, for muscles to contract, and for the heart to beat.
So thallium puts on a potassium disguise.
That's a great way to put it.
The cell's firewall, this ATPase pump, looks at the thallium molecule floating in the bloodstream, says, "Oh, close enough, you look like potassium, come on in," and actively pulls the poison inside the cell.
Yes, the body actively participates in its own destruction through this molecular mimicry.
It's like a computer virus disguising itself as a software update to bypass the firewall.
That is a perfect analogy. But once the thallium is inside the cell, the disguise comes off.
What happens then?
Thallium has a high affinity for sulfhydryl groups. These are specific chemical bonds found on vital enzymes within the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell.
Oh boy.
The thallium binds to these enzymes and literally jams the gears of cellular respiration. The chemical reactions that generate energy are halted. The cell can no longer breathe. It suffocates from the inside out.
Wow. See, in the cozy mystery novels, the victim takes a sip of the poison tea, clutches their chest, and drops dead on the Persian rug while the detective gasps. It's fast, dramatic, and relatively clean.
Right. Very dramatic.
But what was the actual day-to-day reality for Auntie Carrie's victims? Because suffocation at a cellular level doesn't sound fast or clean.
No, it is a protracted, agonizing descent.
Yeah.
Because thallium acts so slowly, shutting down metabolic pathways cell by cell, the progression of the poisoning mimics a devastating, mysterious chronic illness.
So think about Evelyn Lindbergh, Caroline's sister-in-law, or Christina Mickelson, her stepmother, or Marianne Mickelson, her brother's widow. These women didn't die in an afternoon.
No, they suffered for months. In the initial phase of exposure, the symptoms are incredibly vague and nonspecific.
Like what?
The victims reported nausea, severe fatigue, and what they described as strange, migrating, cramping pains in their abdomens and legs.
That could be anything.
Exactly. But as the poison accumulates and the destruction of the nervous system accelerates, the victims enter the mid-phase. This is characterized by profound, debilitating polyneuropathy.
The nerve endings misfiring.
Exactly. The myelin sheath protecting the nerves begins to degrade. The victims experienced excruciating hyperalgesia, which is an extreme sensitivity to touch.
Like how extreme?
The pain was so severe that even the weight of a cotton bedsheet resting on their toes would cause them to scream in agony.
From a bedsheet, that is horrifying.
They lost the ability to walk, they were bedridden, completely dependent on the care of others.
Dependent on the care of Auntie Carrie, who was sitting right there by the bed, brewing them another cup of tea to help them keep their strength up.
And then the late-phase hallmarks of thallium poisoning emerge.
Sure.
Massive, sudden hair loss, known as alopecia.
Oh, right, because it impacts dividing cells.
Yes, the thallium directly attacks the rapidly dividing cells in the hair follicles. The victims would wake up to find clumps of their hair on their pillows.
That's terrifying.
Shortly after, the poison attacks the optic nerve. Their vision would blur, then darken, until they were completely blind.
Blind, too.
Yes, the terminal phase was an agonizing slide into respiratory failure and cardiac arrest, entirely conscious but trapped in a blind, hairless, excruciatingly painful body.
I want you, the listener, to really imagine the psychological horror of this. You are lying in bed for weeks. You are going blind. Your hair is falling out. Every nerve in your body feels like it's on fire.
Unthinkable.
And the whole time, plump, smiling Auntie Carrie is wiping your brow, offering you comfort, and spoon-feeding you the very chemical that is slowly torturing you to death.
What's fascinating here is that this raises a profound question about the sociology and the medical infrastructure of the 1950s.
Yeah, how did she get away with it?
Right, if the symptoms were so horrific and the decline took weeks or months, how did one woman link herself to at least 4 agonizing deaths in the same family before anyone stopped her?
The sources point to what forensic historians call the detection gap of the mid-20th century. Auntie Carrie operated inside a massive blind spot created by both sociological assumptions and medical limitations.
The medical establishment essentially, albeit unwittingly, paved the way for her success. The doctors treating these women took what the literature calls the path of least resistance in their diagnostics.
Think about the last time you went to the doctor with a weird, lingering stomach cramp or unexplainable fatigue. Unless you have an incredibly proactive physician, they probably told you it was a stomach bug or stress or maybe a mild vitamin deficiency.
Right, they look for the obvious.
They give you generic diagnosis because 99% of the time the simplest answer is the correct one. That exact diagnostic tendency is what a patient killer exploits.
Imagine a busy general practitioner in 1950 Sydney. An elderly woman presents with cramps and weakness. A month later, she has nerve pain. Later still, her hair is thinning and her eyesight is failing.
And because it's so slow.
Because thallium acts so slowly and the initial symptoms mimic common ailments, the doctors misdiagnosed the victims repeatedly. In the early stages, they called it gastroenteritis.
Sure.
In the mid stages, they diagnosed severe polyneuritis or a mysterious viral infection. When the women finally went blind and died, the doctors simply threw up their hands, signed the death certificates, and attributed the fatalities to severe complications of old age.
The illusion of natural causes.
Right.
Because the decline was slow and because the victims were elderly women, the doctors weren't looking for foul play.
It was medical myopia combined with ageism and sexism, really.
Definitely. The idea of a sweet grandmother operating as a serial killer simply did not compute in the rigid social hierarchy of 1950s Australia.
The symptoms of chronic thallium exposure can be remarkably similar to advanced diabetic neuropathy or rapidly progressing neurodegenerative diseases. Unless a physician is specifically trained to look for heavy metal poisoning, they will instinctively bend the clinical data to fit the most common, benign explanation.
Right.
The poison itself isn't invisible. The social and professional context in which it is administered is simply unequipped to recognize it.
But eventually, the sheer volume of tragedy became undeniable. I mean, when multiple members of the exact same family, specifically the ones who had been sharing meals with Caroline Grills, all started losing their hair and going blind, someone finally woke up.
Yes, the tipping point of the entire investigation is a moment that feels entirely lifted from the climax of an Agatha Christie novel.
It really does. So in April 1953, Eveline Lundberg falls gravely ill with the exact same symptoms that killed her relatives.
Okay.
Despite the pain and the confusion, she experiences a moment of profound clarity. She becomes convinced that someone is poisoning her, and she confides this terrifying suspicion to her son-in-law, John Downey.
John Downey.
John Downey is the absolute hero of this story.
He really is.
He starts watching Caroline Grills. He notices her hyper-focused, almost obsessive behavior regarding the tea service.
Like she wouldn't let anyone else pour it.
Right. He sees that she is desperate to pour the tea, desperate to hand specific cups to specific people, but she never, ever drinks from the cups she prepares for her victims.
A huge red flag.
Huge. So, Downey takes action. One afternoon, Caroline serves a cup of tea to Eveline. Eveline takes a few sips and pushes it away. While Caroline is out of the room, Downey quietly takes that unfinished cup of tea, pours the remaining liquid into an empty glass jam jar, seals it, and hides it.
That humble jam jar was the smoking gun that destroyed the illusion.
It really was.
It breached the cozy, subjective domesticity of the suburban kitchen and introduced the cold, empirical reality of the forensic laboratory. Downey took that jar directly to the police, who sent it to the government analyst department.
And this is where the 1950s chemistry comes back into play. Because how did a 1950s lab actually prove there was thallium in that tea? They didn't have computer readouts?
No, they didn't. In the mid-20th century, forensic toxicologists relied heavily on qualitative chemical analysis, specifically colorimetric tests and precipitation reactions.
Okay, colorimetric. Sounds colorful.
It is. They were essentially performing advanced, highly controlled chemistry experiments on the evidence. To test the tea in that jam jar, the analyst would have prepared the sample to isolate any heavy metals and then introduced a specific chemical reagent containing iodide ions.
So they are dropping a chemical trigger into the tea.
Yes, and the chemistry is quite beautiful in its absolute finality. If thallium ions are present in the solution, they react immediately with the iodide ions to form a new compound,
Which is what?
thallium iodide. This new compound is highly insoluble in water, and it has a very distinct bright yellow color.
Bright yellow.
The moment the reagent is added, a heavy, bright yellow solid instantly precipitates, meaning it physically falls out of the liquid solution and settles at the bottom of the test tube.
Oh, wow. So the invisible poison suddenly becomes a bright yellow neon sign.
Exactly. The sudden appearance of that yellow precipitate was the undeniable scientific confirmation. That simple qualitative test gave the Sydney police the evidence they needed to arrest Caroline Grills and, crucially, to secure the warrants to exhume the bodies of her previous victims.
And when they dug up the graves of Christina Mickelson, Marianne Mickelson, and John Lundberg, the analysts found thallium in their remains, too. Because heavy metals, unlike organic poisons, don't just fade away, do they?
No, they are incredibly persistent. When the body realizes it is being poisoned by a heavy metal, it tries to process and eliminate it, which severely damages the kidneys.
Right.
But over a protracted period of exposure, the body actually mistakes the thallium for calcium and begins sequestering it directly into the skeletal structure.
It builds it into the bones.
Yes. Furthermore, thallium binds tightly to keratinized tissues, specifically the hair and fingernails. Even after the soft tissues of the victims had decomposed in the earth, the chemical signature of the poison remained locked in their bones and hair.
But here is the terrifying caveat to the 1950s detection gap. The government analyst was only able to perform that precipitation test because John Downey handed them a concentrated liquid suspect sample in a jam jar.
Exactly.
What if Downey hadn't been suspicious? What if he hadn't saved that tea?
If Downey hadn't intervened, Caroline Grills likely would have continued killing with absolute impunity until she died of old age.
That's terrifying.
It is. In the 1950s, those specific chemical precipitation tests were rarely, if ever, performed as part of a standard postmortem autopsy unless the police already strongly suspected heavy metal poisoning.
Right. They wouldn't just guess.
They did not possess the technology for rapid, broad-spectrum chemical screening. That technological limitation created a poisoner's window, an era where a patient, careful killer operating within the domestic sphere could remain entirely undetected.
But that window has closed. Let's talk about modern forensics, because if Auntie Carrie tried to pull this teacup routine today, she wouldn't make it past the victim's first trip to the emergency room.
Oh, absolutely not. The technological evolution over the last 70 years has been staggering. Today, if a patient presents with unexplained neuropathy and hair loss, a toxicologist will utilize a machine called an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer, or ICP-MS.
I read about this in the sources, but I need you to explain how it actually works, because it sounds like science fiction.
It's incredible technology.
It can detect thallium at parts per billion levels. How does a machine see something that small?
Well, it doesn't see it in the traditional sense. It weighs it at an atomic level.
Weighs it?
Yes. The machine takes a microscopic sample, say a drop of blood or a dissolved fragment of a fingernail, and injects it into a plasma torch.
A plasma torch.
This plasma is composed of argon gas that has been heated to approximately 10,000 degrees Kelvin, which is literally as hot as the surface of the sun.
Wait, how hot? 10,000 degrees. So it completely destroys the sample.
It instantly vaporizes it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't just vaporize it. The extreme thermal energy rips the electrons right off the atoms, converting the sample into a cloud of positively charged fundamental ions.
Okay, we're back to ions.
These ions are then pulled into a vacuum chamber and accelerated through a massive electromagnetic field. Because every element on the periodic table has a unique atomic mass, the magnetic field bends the trajectory of the ions differently, based on how heavy they are.
Oh, I see.
A detector at the end of the chamber counts the exact number of thallium ions that hit it. It is impossibly precise.
And because of that precision, modern forensics can do something truly mind-bending with a single strand of the victim's hair.
Yes, because human hair grows at a relatively constant rate of about 1 centimeter per month, and because it permanently incorporates whatever systemic toxins are circulating in the blood at the time of formation.
An analyst can basically read it.
Exactly. They can take a single long strand of hair, cut it into millimeter segments, and analyze each segment individually using the ICP-MS.
It's like reading the rings of a tree.
Precisely. They create a chronological temporal map of the poisoning. They can look at the data and say, you know, the victim received a massive dose of thallium exactly 42 days ago, a smaller dose 30 days ago, and nothing for the last 2 weeks.
That kind of temporal record would have been absolute magic to the analysts in 1953, who were limited to looking for a yellow precipitate in a test tube.
Magic.
Yes.
Modern technology has fundamentally altered the landscape of murder. Authors of modern crime fiction can no longer rely on medical ignorance or a lack of chemical screening to hide their villains. The cozy teacup poisoning is officially dead as a viable, real-world crime.
Scientifically speaking, yes. The methodology has been deflated.
But the technology changed. The human pathology did not. I want to zero in on the sociology of the poisoner because that is where the true horror of Caroline Grylls lies.
Yes, the motive. The sources explicitly note that while she did receive some modest inheritances from the wills of her victims, financial gain was not her primary driver. She wasn't killing for money.
No, the modest financial gain was entirely incidental. The true motive, the psychological engine driving her actions, was rooted in power.
It was absolute sociopathic control. She maintained this sweet, grandmotherly demeanor, this perpetual, unwavering smile throughout her entire trial.
Which is chilling.
It is. Her absolute insistence on serving the food, on being the primary caregiver, wasn't about love. It was a manifestation of an intense pathological desire to dictate life and death within her domestic sphere.
Yes.
She was serving death under the guise of domestic love. In fiction, the villains are usually portrayed as cold, calculating intellectuals. Auntie Carrie proves that real malice is often cloaked in the most mundane, affectionate gestures imaginable. The sweetness literally curdled into horror.
It is a profound, devastating subversion of care. And it deeply unsettles us because it violates the most fundamental social contracts we rely upon to function.
Like trusting our family.
Exactly. The inherent trust we place in our family members and the expectation of safety within our own homes.
Right.
When the person wiping your brow is the one killing you, the entire foundation of human connection collapses.
Okay. So, what does this all mean? We have moved from the chaotic, unfiltered deaths of the 19th century frontier, where a lightning bolt or a wild hog could end your existence in a second, to the covert, deeply controlled, insidious murders of the 20th century, in a suburban kitchen.
Yes, a huge shift.
We've seen how humanity tried to cope with this by writing cozy mysteries with neat little rules. But how do we today, in the 21st century, mentally process the sheer cruelty of mortality?
We still have to process it.
Right. We are insulated from the wild hogs, and mass spectrometry protects us from the poison tea. But the existential dread of death is still there.
The anxiety remains, and so the coping mechanism must evolve. We still use lore. We still use narrative structures to explain the darkness to ourselves. We just use a different, highly modern format.
Which brings us to the final, most abstract, yet profoundly revealing source in our stack. This is a Reddit thread analyzing a piece of lore from the modern video game Destiny.
Right, Destiny.
The lore centers on a cosmic entity known simply as the Winnower.
The Winnower is essentially the game's personification of darkness, of universal entropy, and of the reduction of all life to its most essential, victorious components. It is the ultimate apex predator of the cosmos.
And what strikes me immediately when reading the text of this lore is the tone. The writers didn't make the Winnower sound like a booming, wrathful, fire and brimstone god.
No, they didn't.
It doesn't sound like a monster. It sounds conversational.
It is deceptively affable. It adopts a tone of familiar, almost weary camaraderie.
Listen to how it speaks directly to the player in the text. It says, "Let's chat, shall we? One more nice sit down for the books. Did you think you wouldn't hear from me again after all this? You'd have missed me, I hope, and I would certainly have missed you."
It's incredibly casual.
It is. It refers to the universe as a sedimentary necrolite and a sweet silicate shellfish. But underneath that polite banter, it advocates for the ultimate ruthless survival of the fittest.
Right, it's very Darwinian.
It says, you exist because you have been more suited to it than all the others. Steal what you require from another rather than spend the hours to build it yourself. Break foolish rules. Why would you love regulation?
It frames predation, exploitation, and violence not as moral evils, but as fundamental, unavoidable biological truths.
Which is a scary thought.
It is. It argues that the rules and regulations we build, the morality we construct, the laws we pass, the empathy we champion, are merely artificial crutches designed to protect those who are unworthy of existence.
And it explicitly rejects the idea of being a cartoon villain. It says caricatures of villainy are out of style, I hear. Guess I am no cackling mastermind.
It wants to be seen as a natural force.
Right. It goes on. It was not the trick of standing upright that lifted you from the dust. It was the mastery of fire, the cooking of cold corpse meat. That is not any unique faction's province, neither good nor evil. It is simply truth.
The cooking of cold corpse meat.
That is a staggeringly brutal phrase to drop into a casual conversation.
It is brutal to our civilized sensibilities. But from the entity's perspective, it is merely stating an objective biological reality. The Winnower describes existence as a billion electrons taking the path of least resistance.
Which echoes what we said about the lightning in Arkansas.
Exactly. It argues that whether a civilization claims to follow the light or the darkness, whether they claim to be good or evil, their fundamental actions of survival, of consuming other organisms to live, of expanding their territory, of fighting to exist, are all playing by its rules.
So even the good guys are playing its game.
Right. Every time a creature eats, every time a cell outcompetes another cell, it is validating the Winnower's philosophy.
So why do modern people in the 21st century consume this specific flavor of nihilistic cosmic lore? If we connect the Winnower directly back to Caroline Grills and the Arkansas frontier, the parallels are terrifying. Think about it. Isn't the Winnower just Caroline Grills operating on a cosmic scale?
The structural similarities are undeniable. Look at the methodology. Caroline Grills smiled, she offered comfort, she poured a warm cup of tea, and used that mask of approachability to systematically erase the lives of her family members for her own psychological empowerment.
Right.
The Winnower speaks to the player like a casual friend sitting next to you on the couch, while calmly advocating for the theft of existence and the reduction of all life to a single, ruthless victor. Both entities use the camouflage of politeness and inevitability to disguise absolute sociopathic destruction.
And what about the Arkansas frontier? How does the cooking of cold corpse meat relate to Ben Smith jumping in the river or the Reuben Ford turkey hunt?
The 19th century frontier is the rawest, most unvarnished expression of the Winnower's philosophy in human history. It is the literal, unfiltered winnowing of life.
The wild hog.
Yes, when that wild hog wandered into the cabin in 1896 and attacked the infant, it wasn't acting out of malice or evil. It was acting out of biological imperative. It was acting out of survival. It was taking the path of least resistance.
Just doing what it does.
Exactly. The sheer, staggering volume of accidental deaths in those Luganbühl records, the drownings, the lightning strikes, the shootouts over minor insults, that is the chaotic churn of existence before humanity manages to impose the foolish rules of civilization upon it.
The very regulations that the Winnower mocks, the laws, the mass spectrometers, the safety warnings on dynamite.
Precisely. We build those regulations to protect ourselves from the winnowing. And by creating modern lore like this video game entity, a character who takes the horrific, random rules of death and suffering and explains them as just the natural order of a billion electrons taking the path of least resistance, we are engaging in the exact same psychological coping mechanism that society used in the 1920s when Anne Hocking wrote Death in a Teacup.
We are putting a face on it. We're domesticating the chaos.
We are putting a recognizable, conversational, articulate face on the terrifying, chaotic reality of death.
Yeah.
Whether we are framing murder as an intellectual puzzle to be solved by a polite British detective with a magnifying glass, or we are framing the heat death of the universe as a philosophical debate with a chill cosmic entity, the goal is the same. We are trying to make the unbearable reality of our own fragility easier to digest. We are trying to build a narrative structure where we have some semblance of understanding, if not actual control.
Man, We try so hard to put an X-ray frame around the muddy waters of death, to categorize it, to regulate it, but the messy reality always bleeds through the edges.
That's the way it does.
Whether it's the sudden, blunt violence of a runaway horse or a lightning strike in 1890s Arkansas, the deceptive chemical camouflage of an Auntie Carrie's slipping rat poison into a teacup in 1953, or the cosmic entropic justifications of a modern video game villain. The reality of death is always there, waiting for us to make a mistake or waiting for us to trust the wrong person in the wrong moment.
It is the single great constant of our existence. And our reaction to it, our desperate need to fictionalize it, to study it in laboratories, to outsmart it with technology like mass spectrometry, to write rules around it, is what makes human history so relentlessly compelling.
We just can't let it be.
No, we refuse to simply accept the chaos. We fight the winnowing with science, with laws, and most importantly, with our stories.
I think that perfectly wraps up the intense journey we've been on today. We have traveled from the brutal, accidental mortalities of the American frontier through the deceptive chemical camouflage of a 1950s grandmother's teacup, all the way to the cosmic justifications of modern video game lore. Thank you for sitting at the table and coming along on this deep dive with us.
It has been a dark but incredibly illuminating path to trace. And as we conclude, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to ponder as you go about your day.
Okay, what is it?
Well, we look back at the 1950s and we marvel at how a simple, comforting cup of tea could be such a massive blind spot for hidden danger. Annie Carey succeeded for years simply because the medical technology and the social expectations of the time could not comprehend that a grandmother offering nourishment was actually a threat.
Right. The doctors couldn't see past the tea set, and society couldn't see past the floral dress.
So, consider the architecture of our lives today. We consider ourselves highly advanced, protected by mass spectrometers and digital surveillance. But with our modern reliance on hyper-convenience, on food delivery apps arriving at our doors, from unknown ghost kitchens, on automated algorithms dictating our information, on digital systems that we trust implicitly without understanding how they work. What seemingly innocent, mundane, daily ritual of ours will future forensic historians look back on in 50 years and realize was the perfect, invisible vehicle for modern malice.
Oh, wow.
What is the 21st century's cup of tea?
That is a deeply unsettling thought to leave on, but a necessary one. Stay curious, everyone, and keep questioning the world around you, even the parts that seem perfectly safe.
This has been Enter the Crime Delivery. Global true crime told like a documentary.